There's been a lot of talk, I think, from some of the other clubs, and in some ways slightly hysterical views, that the APT regime and the challenge to it could be the end of football as we know it, which I feel has always been exaggerated. APT, in its current form, pending any potential change to the PSR regime that may come in the future, I think the APT regime as it is now is probably here to stay. Well, the story goes back to 2021 on the back of the Newcastle United takeover by Saudi Arabia's PIF. There was a bit of a stir in the Premier League shareholder meeting and room, and together they wanted to implement a new regime to strengthen the related party transaction rules that existed within the Premier League rules. And they brought in what was then known as the associated party rules. These gave the league more extensive rights to look at any transaction with an average value of more than £1 million per annum, and particularly to assess for fair market value any such £1 million per annum transactions that were with what was known as associated parties, which was a definition that extended the relationship from related parties to a more broader relationship. So in situations where there was shared directors or other means of a connection between owners and other businesses. So effectively that created a lot of power for the Premier League. But in 2023, the clubs, together with the various working groups within the Premier League, decided that they wanted to extend the associated party transaction rules further and put in some more detail and some more tweaks to the rules. At that time, Manchester City warned the Premier League that they felt that the rules had gone too far and threatened that if those rules were brought in, that they would consider arbitration and a challenge to the legality of the APT regime. Sure enough, in February of 2024, those rules were brought in that extended the original 2021 rules, and Manchester City commenced an arbitration. In September of 2024, the arbitration was concluded and a decision agreed with Manchester City that for a couple of reasons, the APT rules that had been put in place were unlawful and therefore were void and were not valid. Manchester City then urged the Premier League to pause, but the Premier League believed that they could correct the issues with the APT rules by putting in place new rules, and they did that towards the end of 2024. Manchester City went further and said that the new rules were also a breach of European competition law, and therefore that they were challenging again in arbitration the new rules for legality. And this settlement is a settlement of that situation, in that Manchester City, on their part, accept that the rules that were put in place at the back end of 2024 are valid and are binding, and the APT regime as it is now is therefore accepted by Manchester City. What we don't know is what Manchester City have received as part of that settlement. Yeah, so I think in any settlement you have a combination of both parties being happy and both parties being slightly frustrated that was the outcome. I think in this situation in particular, by the time you get to APT2, Manchester City have little to lose except for the costs of exploring APT2 in a formal hearing. The reality is, even if City had lost completely in APT2, the situation would have been that the rules would have been as they are now, the rules that they have accepted. So in many ways, Manchester City had a free hit at APT2, aside from the costs of that hearing. For the Premier League, there was a little bit more risk because the Premier League could not cope easily with another loss on the matter and could not have easily accepted that the rules that have been in place since the changes in February 2024 were effectively void. And so that would have created all sorts of issues for the regime in terms of what it meant for the proposals that have been put to the Premier League under that APT regime all the way back since those rules were put in place. So for the Premier League, I think it made a lot of sense to settle this situation. And for City to settle it, I think that they only would have settled it had they been given something within that settlement of real tangible value to them. And I think that could be a number of things. It could be some compensation in respect of the matters that were brought to the APT arbitration. So that would be the sponsorship deal with Etihad, that would be the sponsorship deal with First Abu Dhabi Bank, or it could be another sponsorship deal that wasn't tabled at that time, or it could be the costs of the whole situation, which may well have been significant. So maybe as part of the settlement, there was an agreement that the Premier League would settle Manchester City's costs of both APT1 and APT2. And it's also possible that City received some softer promises from the Premier League, such as that the Premier League would put certain provisions back to the Premier League clubs at the next shareholder meeting, with no guarantee that the shareholders would accept those changes, but with a promise that the Premier League would table them. So we don't know exactly what Manchester City received as consideration for agreeing to the settlement, but I think it's clear that because they had little to lose, that they would have received something. Now, I've always been of the view that the two matters were separate, and that the 115 situation was now too far gone for a similar quiet settlement with a 1 or 2 line announcement on the end of it. In any event, 115 related to a period that predated all of the associated party transaction rules, and so it's hard to see that there was ever a distinct overlap. That said, I do think that part of the reason that City instigated the arbitration was as part of an overall softer legal battle in the background, with one side trying to embarrass another in one case and vice versa. So not connected substantively, but of course you can't look in isolation at the fact that Manchester City and the Premier League are, in a sense, at war. Well, I think first of all it's telling that Newcastle United were never a co-claimant with Manchester City, so it was possible that Newcastle, right from the start of the challenge, could have either decided to challenge the 2021 rules well in advance of Manchester City, or could have gone as a co-claimant with Manchester City, sharing the costs, being involved in the organisation of the claim, being involved in the selection of the legal representatives and the conduct overall. And they chose not to do that. Now, what they did do was offer their services as a witness, and clearly Newcastle United had experienced some of the processes around the deliberations on fair market value of associated party transactions, and did, it seems, take a discount on some of those contracts and sponsorship agreements. Now, interestingly, in respect of Newcastle United, now that we've seen their accounts, it transpires that both Seller and also Noon, as the two main sponsors that they have, are already captured in any event as related parties. So if you go to the back of the Newcastle United accounts, they are stated to be related parties. That would mean that even if no associated party transaction rules existed, that Newcastle would still be captured by the previous regime within the Premier League rules relating to related party transactions and the need for those to be at fair market value. So whilst on the face of it, there may have been some perception that Newcastle United in particular are waiting for the outcome of the APT hearings before putting in place further sponsorship agreements, it is likely that in actual fact they were an interested party, but it won't be a game changer in the way that perhaps many expected. In terms of other clubs, we do know that Chelsea have also put through associated party transactions. We know, for example, that their Infinite Athlete sponsorship was an associated party transaction pursuant to some of the shared ownership of some of the directors and some of the ownership group of Chelsea. So they went through that process, and whether they were in favour of the associated party transaction regime or not is unclear. But certainly they found ways to live with it. There's been a lot of talk, I think, from some of the other clubs, and in some ways slightly hysterical views that the APT regime and the challenge to it could be the end of football as we know it, which I feel has always been exaggerated. And I think on the back of the settlement of this situation, certainly now is found to have been misplaced and exaggerated. Certainly City accepting that the current rules are valid and binding means that it's going to be very hard for somebody down the road to challenge those rules as being void or unlawful. It's not to say that City's settlement is binding on other clubs. It's not. Because Newcastle, for example, were not a co-claimant with Manchester City, they clearly played no part in the settlement that was agreed. So theoretically, Newcastle could still pick up the reins from Manchester City. But as I say, I think it's unlikely now that that would be the logical outcome for APT. And I think, therefore, APT, in its current form, pending any potential change to the PSR regime that may come in the future, I think the APT regime as it is now is probably here to stay.